Thank you all for coming out in this weather to the very first meeting of the Garland County Historical Society in 2024. Julie Nix is going to come up here and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you all. You were given the minutes of our October and our November meetings.
Just November. You have it, but.
Oh, you didn't give the
They
October
got
on?
them.
Okay,
I
I'm
didn't
sorry.
do it.
Okay, well, we will be approving the minutes for October and November. Do I hear a motion, please? Kyle? We have a second?
Second.
Tom French, second. All those in favor, please say aye. Thank you. The minutes are approved. Liz Robbins, our executive director, will be coming up here to make an introduction. We're gonna have a great year this year, and thank y'all again for coming today.
I want to second that. Thank y'all for coming on this very rainy day, but at least it's not icing. Yep. I'd like to invite you to our February program. It will not be on the third Tuesday of the month as the meetings usually are. It will be on the second Tuesday because the library had a scheduling problem with the meeting room, and we were happy to move. The second Tuesday, February 13th, our speaker will be Diana Hampo. Some of you may know her. She's a very vivacious, fun speaker, and she's the daughter of I. Ranger McDaniel, the renowned mid-20th century architect who designed First Baptist Church. And I could list a million wonderful buildings and homes here in Hot Springs. And his father was a renowned architect here too. He was also in Stalag 13 during World War II and escaped, and was the figure that the Steve McQueen character in the Great Escape movie is based on. He's just a remarkable man. And she's going to be telling stories about her father and about buildings in town and giving us the inside scoop on everything we do. Now, today, we're very thrilled to have Dr. Dan Chmill with us today. We have heard him speak before. He is delightful. He's originally from Pennsylvania, but we've adopted him down here. He earned his PhD in history from the University of Kansas in 2022. And today, he's an interpretive park ranger and historian for Hot Springs National Park. And currently, he's the project manager for a wonderful oral history project called We Bathe the World, recording African American histories at Hot Springs National Park. This project has received much media coverage and praise, and he's going to tell us more about it today. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks, everyone. Liz, thank you so much. Thank you again for everyone here as well for making the trip in the rain for this presentation. And welcome to anyone who is listening in online. My name is Dan Chmill. I am an interpretive ranger and historian at Hot Springs National Park, right down the road. And today's presentation that I'd like to give will probably take about 40-45 minutes. It is called More Stories to Tell, African American Bathhouse Employees and Their Contributions to Hot Springs National Park. So to start, I actually wanted to, as most park rangers often do, is to get a little bit of audience participation. And the question I have up here is, when it comes to the town of Hot Springs, which encompasses both the city of Hot Springs and the national park, has for pretty much both histories of both town and park, what stories do we usually tell when it comes to people who have come to the park? what are some names that usually we pop in and we tell either friends and family right away when it comes to visiting hot springs?
Gangsters.
Gangsters,
Baseball.
baseball. Anyone else?
The ill and the infirm.
Absolutely. Folks that came here for their health, whether that is common folk or celebrities. You guys pretty much nailed it. But when it comes down to it, the stories that we tell often do revolve around the history of gangsters coming through hot springs, celebrities, whether that be presidents like President Roosevelt up here, or Kevin Costner, as well as the history of spring training and baseball in hot springs, with Babe Ruth in the bottom right corner. All of these have incredibly rich histories in the town of Hot Springs and are part of the fabric of both the town and the national park. But at the same time, one of the exciting things that we're trying to do here at the park is that there are new, but really old stories that we can tell about both hot springs, about the national park, and how these stories connect to even city, state, region, and national stories of the United States. Here are just a couple of snippets of bathhouse attendants and bathhouse employees who worked in the bathhouses here in the national park throughout the 1880s up until today. We have folks on the left, which are from the top left, which has James Ferguson, Charles Amos, and Richard Lemons. That was actually in a Christmas card that the Quapaw Bathhouse sent out in the 1930s. Had each of their heads like it was a 1980s sitcom, just popped up, ready for you to have them wait on you. Iola Bedford, she actually gave an interview, and an oral history interview in the 1990s to the National Park. And we have folks, bathhouse attendants, that even made it on the covers of magazines. One down here made it on the cover of Arkansas magazine in 1979. So before we get going with any of these stories, I just wanted to run over for anyone who has never taken a bath or has taken a bath and not necessarily gone and delved deep into the operations of a bathhouse is, what's a bathhouse attendant? As we can see, the boilerplate definition for it is the bathhouse attendants administer the thermal waters to patients and patrons in bathhouses within and outside the national park. Patients and patrons is one of the specific things to recall here, is that up until the 1940s and 50s, and even today, folks are coming to hot springs for their health. They are coming to use the thermal water, to bathe in it medicinally, and to drink it for their health. But also, beginning in the 30s and moving well into the 20th and 21st century, as I'm sure we can notice if we go down Central Avenue today, that most folks are coming to hot springs and going to the baths for the leisure experience, for mindfulness, for rest and relaxation. One of the things that I have always tried to highlight as I've begun this project last year is that this was skilled labor. This was not, while this was a service industry, this was an incredibly skilled profession that these men and women had, that they passed down within their family and within their community. It required both medical knowledge, having bathhouse attendants pass exams and both physical and mental examinations, as well as demanding physical labor. Working in bathhouses in hot and humid conditions, not just in the summertime, when of course the temperature hits the triple digits, but also every single day, even in the winter. Lastly, or second to last, this could be a lucrative job. That this, in 1910, attendants made over $100,000 collectively, which in today's money is $3.3 million. So much of that went back into the community. It made Hot Springs one of the premier medical and leisure destinations, not just for anyone, but for Black Americans. And in a spot in the American South in the early 20th century, that was incredibly rare. It was something that allowed Hot Springs to put itself on the map and allow folks from the Midwest, from Pittsburgh, from Chicago, from everywhere to come and find safe haven and health in Hot Springs water. When you're in the bathhouse, as we move from the 19th into the 20th century, the jobs in the bathhouse expanded. There originally were just attendants, those that administered the baths, but throughout the 20th and into the 21st century, we learned that there were jobs like helpers, which were apprentices, that were the last hired, first fired during the downtimes of the bathing business. They usually worked under one specific attendant. We had attendants, we had packers who worked in the pack rooms of the bathhouses. The pack rooms are areas where hot towels are soaked in thermal water and wrapped around specific parts of the body parts that are ailing, different struggles that folks would have had. The pack room itself was its own specific place within the bathhouse. And lastly, massage therapists. Massage therapists back then, known as masseuses or masseurs, would use massage therapies, mostly Swedish massages, throughout after taking a bath in the bathhouses. This is something that obviously visitors can still get today, but back then, up until about the 1930s and 40s, was specifically for whites, were massage therapists. Only in the 30s and 40s, and then breaking through into the 60s and 70s, especially with the rise of Black-only bathhouses on Malvern Avenue, the massage therapy section of a bathhouse expanded as well. So what I wanted to do today is just highlight a couple of stories that I have uncovered and that our team at the National Park has uncovered throughout the past year. These delve back into the 19th century. They come all the way up to present day with oral history interviews of both former employees and folks that have lived in Hot Springs community for their entire lives. And the idea behind it is really, I'll highlight at the very end, is not only to replace these stories that we've been telling, but to add to them, to show the vibrancy of Hot Springs history, to show the overall and overwhelming bit of history that is offered to folks that come from all shapes and sizes, all colors and creeds. Hot Springs and the thermal waters that gush from Hot Springs Mountain really do have something to offer every single citizen in this country. So I really wanted to start diving back to the middle and late part of the 19th century. Many of the folks that first started to work in the bathhouses here in Hot Springs, if you could call them bathhouses, as I'm sure many folks in this room know, the early advent of the bathhouses were little more than sheds, with the steam bubbling right up through the floorboards. But into the 1870s and especially the 1880s, the bathhouses right on Central Avenue or Valley Street began to grow more and more extravagant. The folks that were working in there oftentimes were born enslaved. One of them is the woman behind me. Her name was Maddie Fielding. Maddie Fielding was born enslaved around 1860 or 1861 in Alabama. She was never sure. When she went up to retirement age in 1926, which is what you see her aged on the right, when the National Park Service asked her how old she wasn't necessarily sure. And so to collect her pension, both the Fielding family and the National Park Service delved through records to try to ascertain where and when Maddie Fielding was born. She married in the 1880s and took her family, which she had her husband and 9 children, to Hot Springs. She first worked in the Army-Navy General Hospital. She was one of the first laundresses working in the Army-Navy Hospital in 1889 after the building opened up in 1887. She became a bathhouse attendant at the government-free bathhouse, which was behind what is now the Quapaw Bathhouse. If you go to the national park now and stroll on the Grand Promenade, there is a seep of water that is bubbling right out of the ground. That is very, very close to the exact location of the original government-free bathhouse. And Maddie Fielding was the head attendant for the entire female department. She worked there from 1904, which as we see here on the left, to 1926. In that time, she made over $300,000 in today's money. When she retired, the superintendent of the national park wrote, and I quote, "Her service has been honest and faithful, and her present condition is not the result of misconduct on her part in any way. She has a fine record with not even a reprimand." Maddie Fielding and others worked in the government-free bathhouse in Hot Springs under both incredibly difficult conditions and with not the best clientele. Oftentimes, we explain the opulence of Hot Springs and the clientele that rival that opulence. But for the government-free bathhouse, these were folks that were using their last dimes and on their last legs, literally and figuratively, to come to Hot Springs to try to use the thermal water to heal themselves. These were folks that often were vagrants, were unhoused, would have to try to scrimp and save just to stay in Hot Springs for the 3 weeks or the multiple months to try to use the thermal waters. These were the women that Maddie Fielding, and not just Maddie Fielding, but her daughter, Susie Fielding, were also working with day in and day out. They were working nearly 365 days every single year. And this is just a testament to folks that were born enslaved, found their way out of slavery, worked for their freedom, and sustained that to find resources, to find success, and to support a family. In Maddie Fielding's case, a family of 9. Another one from the early years of Hot Springs is a man named Napoleon Rao. Now, Napoleon Rao was born enslaved in North Carolina around 1850 or 1851. One of the impressive things about Mr. Rao is that he not only worked as a bathhouse attendant, his picture is on the right and an illustration of him is on the left. These were both in railroad advertisements for the Missouri Pacific for the Park Hotel. These would move through across the country, and these work for the bathhouses was one of the things and one of the selling points for folks to come to Hot Springs. Another part of the special part for Napoleon Rao's story is that in 1884, the U.S. House of Representatives visited Hot Springs. That sounds like a big deal, and often I'm sure a lot of people in this room even know why. Does anybody know why in the 1880s the U.S. House of Representatives came here and began to look at Hot Springs Reservation?
Turning into a national park.
Getting there, absolutely. Turning into a national park, trying to figure out why so much money was being spent in Hot Springs, specifically for the Creek Arch. The Creek Arch that runs beneath all of the front yards of all the bathhouses even still, it was using an exorbitant amount of money. And so 3 representatives from the House Appropriations Committee came to Hot Springs, shacked up right in the Arlington Hotel, and tried to figure out what was going on. Now, the great part about this is they interviewed everybody. They interviewed bathhouse owners, they interviewed engineers, they interviewed tax collectors. What they also did is they interviewed bathhouse attendants. They interviewed men and women that were working in the bathhouses to try to get an understanding of what life was like in a bathhouse in Hot Springs in the 1880s. And Napoleon Rao testified before the House Committee on Appropriations, describing both the exploitative world of the bathhouse, of the early bathhouse business, how bathhouse owners took much of the money, and how bathhouse attendants had to pay much of their own way to get to work, but also to use all of the supplies while working, whether that is soap, cleaning up the bathhouses and buying their own brooms, brushes, and washing materials. One of the things he also did was petition for African Americans to have their own bathhouses in the 1880s. This is 20 years before the first bathhouse exclusively for African Americans, the Crystal, opened up in 1903. Mr. Rao testified that, quote, "I speak for my people in this matter, and they would be glad to have this bathhouse." Rao petitioned Congress for an African American bathhouse because, and I quote again, "Colored people were prospering here, and all we needed was a place for our people to bathe." But he knew that both Black and white patrons were not comfortable bathing together. The story of Napoleon Rao not just gives us a glimpse of the chaotic scene that unfolded in Hot Springs in the 1880s. Oftentimes, those stories are full of gunfights between rival families and rival bosses and gangs, but they also show the chaos that is unfolding even within the bathhouses, something that we have often take for granted as these pillars of stability in Hot Springs. It also gives us a little hint of the ideas and the contentious ideas of race that are flowing through the town. No pun intended. Now, these stories can also be perfectly and just show up by happenstance. What I have up here is a letter that a man named Hugh Hayes wrote to medical director Harry Halleck on the 26th of October in 1910. Now, I won't go through the whole thing, and I won't have you folks read his cursive, but what Mr. Hayes is writing to is, in 1910, Harry Halleck showed up in Hot Springs, and he saw all of this chaos unfolding. And what he decided was that the bathhouses, many should be torn down and rebuilt, this time not made out of wood, trying to improve sanitary conditions, and also making sure that African-American bathhouse attendants could pass exams so that they could administer the water. Now, this is with ideas of the eugenics movement and the progressive era moving through Hot Springs, just like it moved through the entire United States during this time. Hayes had been working in Hot Springs throughout all of the 1900s, and he wrote to Director Halleck and said, "Will I be able to pass these new exams? I live in Tennessee, and I don't want to travel all the way to Hot Springs just to get shut down, and I got to take the train right back." I found this letter just tucked away in a nondescript part of our National Parks Archive. And as I was reading through it, I got to the second page. And in the second page, Hayes says why he's a little apprehensive about passing the test. It's not that he doesn't feel like he has the intelligence to pass the test. He is actually managing that little sanitarium up in the top left corner. What he's worried about is that about a decade earlier, a horse fell on him and hurt his leg. And I thought, well, that's at least that's an interesting story. It's a little funny. At least he survived. But what I circled here is that where and when the horse fell on him is significant. It fell on him in Fort Assiniboine in Montana while he was serving as a member of the 10th Colored Cavalry in the United States. Bingo. Hugh Hayes was a Buffalo soldier. We had a Buffalo soldier working in the bathhouses. He was born in Tennessee in the 1870s and was a member of the 10th Colored Cavalry from 1896 to 1899. He first visited Hot Springs in 1898 as a direct result of that horse falling on him. His leg remained lame, and the medical officer in Fort Assiniboine sent him to the Army Navy Hospital, where he received treatment for 6 weeks. Granted, on his medical card, it did say that he was, quote, cured, but Hayes did ultimately get his discharge papers from the Army with disability. He became a bathhouse attendant in 1903 and worked for the Lamar and the Park Hotel, walking the same halls and using the same tubs that Napoleon Rao did just a decade earlier. Now, the great story about Hugh Hayes is that it expands Hot Springs history and expands the footprint of Hot Springs' significance well outside of our little town. Throughout Hugh Hayes' life, we have him moving to Fort Assiniboine in Montana, which is where the Buffalo Soldiers of the 10th Cavalry are in the top left. The 10th Cavalry served in the Spanish-American War, which is that painting that you see in the middle. The 10th Cavalry charged San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill with Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders, the exact same groups, black and white, fighting together, trying to expand the American empire. In the Park Hotel, while we can't see the Park Hotel anymore, as it burned down in 1913, we learn of all of the stories and all of the history of not just the impressive and significant folks that walked its halls as patients or patrons, but as the incredibly significant folks that walked its halls as workers, as laborers. Lastly, there is still a story of the Army-Navy General Hospital. As you see here, before the large building built in the 1930s, this was the wood frame structure from 1887 to 1930. And lastly, in a tiny little twist of fate, Hugh Hayes passed away in 1940. He is buried at the National Sailors and Soldiers Home Cemetery in Washington, D.C. He is buried right down the lane, cemeterially speaking, from Senator John Logan. John Logan was influential in securing appropriations for the very Army-Navy General Hospital that introduced Hugh Hayes to Hot Springs National Park. And so all of these intertwined histories came from a letter. Every single one of that is able to get connected from one little letter that was ultimately saved and just tucked away in our archives. This not only speaks to the vibrant history of Hot Springs, but the vibrant work that folks like the Historical Society does, and like we do at the National Park. While this story has not been told until now, it's still there waiting for somebody to find it. That is one of the important things of this project, is to highlight the work that can be done in archives if the community and individuals are willing to both work together and to find the time and energy, which I know is difficult, to do. Now, we can also talk about the ideas of changing labor ideas in the United States. The ideas of unions rising up, of folks beginning to say that that exploitation that was taking place in what we call the Gilded Age, which is the 1880s and 1890s in the United States, where we could say captains of industry like Andrew Carnegie visited Hot Springs, were also in the same breath called robber barons that used manual labor and used physical labor to exploit and profit from it. Similar things were taking place in Hot Springs. As I mentioned, the bathhouse industry by this point in time could be incredibly lucrative. Prices were going up, patrons and patients were visiting, and African-American men and women found value in working in the bathhouses. But Hot Springs did not exist in a vacuum. Places like French Lick in Indiana, Saratoga Springs, Berkeley Springs, Battle Creek, Michigan, all of these places across the country were beginning to use mineral water as a recuperative and a health resource. Oftentimes, they began to hire white help to make white patrons in the North feel as comfortable as can be. In 1904, the Murray's Bathhouse decided to try the same thing. They fired an African-American man named Rufus Gentry, and in his place, they hired a white man. In response, 8 members of the Murray's Bathhouse quit. They struck. This is, in my research so far, one of, if not the earliest, strike that occurred on national park property in the United States. It occurred right here in Hot Springs, right next door to where I work every single day. In our archives, this is the letter that Charles Maurice wrote to the superintendent, saying, "This is to inform you that the following attendants, quote, struck and, quote, walked out without giving me a minute's notice or even arranging for the care of their babies." He wrote this as, "On account of inability to please my patrons and neglect duty, I discharged Rufus Gentry and employed in his place a white man. The strikers refused to work with the white man and walked out, as stated above." And there are both Rufus Gentry's name and the 8 men who were fired. In my research so far, I have yet to find one other bathhouse that hired those 8 men. They were blacklisted for the work that they did for trying to keep their jobs secured for both themselves, their family members, and their community, which they were reinfusing their dollars back into the community day in and day out. Rufus Gentry, matter of fact, to just have things start stacking on top of each other that you're going to forget everything, Rufus Gentry was hired again, even as he was fired. He was hired at the Park Hotel and worked side by side with Hugh Hayes. It is fun to imagine the conversations that these folks would have had in between offering baths to patients and patrons, their histories, their struggles, their successes. All of these things can be wrapped up in one single document. On the left is actually a photo of John Price, one of the striking members. This was him at the Park Hotel in the 1890s, from the Atchison Daily Globe in 1899. Here is just the cherry on top that, we don't always just have to imagine these stories either. That these are the hard, true facts and figures of it. These is how much bathhouse attendants made during these years. These came from superintendent reports, which are yearly reports that the superintendents of all national park sites send to the Secretary of the Interior. We were lucky enough that from the 1890s to 1912, some of the superintendents thought that this was vital information for the Secretary of the Interior to have. And so they compiled these figures. The amount paid to all attendants is in the middle, and the amount in 2023 dollars, I didn't do it for today, so I apologize, maybe a little off for 2024 dollars, but it just shows the amount of wealth and the amount of tangible funds that were flowing back into the Black community in Hot Springs. Yes, sir.
How many units were there?
It's a great question. By 1912, there were just south of 300 attendants. So each attendant before tips was making about a little over $10,000 a year. But most of the superintendents highlight in their superintendent reports that while tips were not included, tips accounted for the majority of salaries for bathhouse attendants, meaning that it really could be an incredibly lucrative job day in and day out.
So were these all bathhouses or just the Park Service bathhouses?
These figures here, sir, are for all bathhouses. So any bathhouse that's rented water from the reservation, they were included. By the 1910s, that included about 21 bathhouses, 10 to 12 that were on the reservation, right on Central Avenue, including the Arlington, as well as 9 to 10 that were outside of town, whether that would be the Rockefeller Bathhouse, whether that is the Imperial Bathhouse, or the African-American bathhouses up on Malvern Avenue. Now, I'm going to move through this one a little faster because I think this crowd probably knows a lot about this story. Does anybody know what this photo behind me is commemorating? Yeah, Liz.
1954 Massachusetts Board of Education naming this park.
Sure is, and she has already jumped it because we have connections to incredibly big moments in American history. We have folks that have visited hot springs and have done the hard work and the research to try to uncover this already. Tim Spofford visited here last year, talking in detail about the Phipps family and the Smith family that were Hot Springs natives that were influential in working to desegregate schools, which is what Brown v. Board of Education ruled in 1954 with the Supreme Court. The pictures here are pictures of the doll test, which began in the 1940s and 50s with Kenneth Clark, the man to the bottom left, and his wife, Mamie Phipps Clark. The doll test was a psychological and sociological experiment that gave definitive, tangible, empirical evidence supporting the idea that segregation, both in culture and in schools, had detrimental effects on both Black and white children, how they view themselves and how they view others. What interested me and what helped me with the help of Tim was to dive into that family. So Mamie Phipps Clark, Mamie Phipps, her mother, Katie, is in the top left. She is that precocious teenager that definitely wants to be taking a photo with her family on the front porch of her house. The man to her left, our right, is her father, Jesse Rufus Smith. Jesse Rufus Smith was a bathhouse attendant and a manager of the Crystal Bathhouse. And one of the most significant contributions that Jesse Smith made, not just to the history of the park, but to the community in Hot Springs, was that he worked his tail off to organize folks. In response to Medical Director Halleck's new examination schedule for bathhouse attendants, seen as an opportunity for some, but as a threat for others, Smith organized bathhouse attendants for the very first time, connecting Hot Springs' local history, an organization of just about 100 bathhouse attendants, into larger stories of labor organizing across the United States. Again, one of the goals of this project is to show that the history of these men and women, the successes, the struggles, and their failures are not in a vacuum here in Hot Springs. That they communicate, they can be in conversation with large stories that appear in American history textbooks across the country. The exact same struggles, the exact same opportunities are relevant and are very tangible here in Hot Springs' history. Not only that, Smith not only tried to organize, but he also worked for the civil and political rights of African Americans in Hot Springs. In here, the background behind his communication, which appeared in 1911, was Smith was concerned that during the state fair, the citizens of Hot Springs wanted to have a celebration of the state fair that was in Little Rock at the time, and they wanted to put on a similar fair in Whittington Park, which was in the national park. Smith, however, communicated to what was the Daily Arkansas Press that over Whittington Park was, quote, an invisible letters that read, quote, no Negroes admitted, that African Americans ceased to be citizens in the common expectation of the term. Smith fought long and hard to put African American civil rights and political rights onto the scene in not just Hot Springs, but across the state of Arkansas. It's pretty evident from both the talk that Tim gave earlier last year to the history books that speak of Mamie Phipps Clark, that a lot of that stuck, that a lot of that was passed down from generation to generation, that men and women that cared for their community, that cared for their people, that cared for the access and health of their people, were passed those ideas down to their children and their children's children. And some of those children's children can do really extraordinary things things that not only changed the course of the history of kids that were going to school in Hot Springs, but kids that were going to school across the country. And not only that, as we move into the 20th century, the national park began to take a proactive step in recording these histories. Oftentimes, folks that were in the service industry were passive individuals. They would serve, they would come into someone's life, and they would go out as quickly as possible. That pretty much happened in this 1954 article written by Catherine Loring for the Chicago Tribune, one of the largest distributed newspapers at the time. She visited Hot Springs in the 1950s, and she went to what she said was the most elegant bathhouse she could find, and that was the Fordyce. I get to work there every day. Some of the volunteers I see also get to work there. It is the definition of extravagance, of opulence, and it catered to those folks. When Catherine went there, she said that she had the great pleasure of being bathed by a pleasant Negro woman whose face was covered with great droplets of perspiration, and her name was Myrtle. In the illustration for the Chicago Tribune, Loring drew a picture of the two of them. Loring's looking a little apprehensive as Myrtle is giving her a bath. Loring was also a little scared that her hair was going to get messed up when she was dunked underwater to get the full effect of a hot springs bath. But after that, we kind of lose the story, and she goes on to talk about the rest of her time in Hot Springs. But I had the question, who is the woman giving her a bath? And in fact, during the 1950s, there's just one Myrtle that was working in the bathhouses at the Fordyce. And that's her. So we go from cartoon to physical person, like that. Her name is Myrtle Cheatham. She worked in the Fordyce bathhouse for decades, and unlike or adding another layer to the work of bathhouse attendants, she didn't always enjoy her job. But she knew that working there would get her, her family, and more important, her children, the resources they need. In the 1990s, she was interviewed through the National Park's Oral History Projects, and she said that we worked to give our children their education because we didn't want to have them wash the bathtubs. And that is a fair and honest statement from a mom that didn't want her kids to go through the same kind of toil and hard work that she put herself through. These are the kind of stories that if we just do a little extra digging, that we get to turn a photograph, turn an illustration into a real person, and that real person, we can find their voice and we can share it with as many people as we can. Now, we talked about, at our early onset, baseball. Baseball is an incredibly important part of Hot Springs history, dating back to almost the 1880s. The contributions and the addition of African-American bathhouse employees can still even contribute to these stories. In the placards that we see around town, the Negro Leagues visited here as much as the National Leagues and the American Leagues in Major League Baseball. They often stayed at the Woodmen of the Union, or the National Baptist, or the Pythian. But even this, we had folks that were working in the bathhouses that didn't have to work in bathhouses because they could swing a bat and throw a ball pretty well too. One of them is the man to the left. His name's Lewis Snoop Wesson. He was a bathhouse attendant at the Majestic for over 30 years. His family all throughout worked in the bathhouses. And on the right is a letter that we have in the Hot Springs archives of the president of the New York Black Yankees asking him to try out. Wesson ultimately left Hot Springs to do a couple stints of Negro League Baseball, playing for the Black Barons in Birmingham, for the Black Yankees, getting to play against some of the most reputable and feared baseball players in the Negro Leagues, like Satchel Paige, gets to play against folks like the Pittsburgh Grays and the Crawford Grays. It is a fantastic history that can only supplement what we have uncovered so far in the the history of baseball in Hot Springs. And then, as we move into the 21st century, we can continue to try to record and bring memories to life. What I have here is an interview that I conducted with Miss Robin Higgins last year. Ms. Higgins was a bath attendant and a massage therapist at the Buckstaff Bathhouse, and like many, learned about the bathing industry and was prepared for the bathing industry, all of the opportunities and struggles that came with it, from members in her community. Most notably, a woman named Ernestine Gwynn. And here is a moment where I found some photos that the National Parks Archives had, that I believe the Historical Society also has, of Miss Gwynn at work in some promotional photos from the National Park.
You brought up a number of folks that you looked up to, whether that's Miss Ernestine Gwynn, and I just wanted to show you some of the info that we found here at the National Park of photos of.
That's Granny right there.
That sure is.
That's Miss Ernestine. Oh, yes. Oh, she was wonderful. Now, see, Granny, she started off, she told me as a packer, that Granny was going to college at A.M. and N, down in Pine Bluff. It's now called University of Arkansas in Pine Bluff, but then it was called A.M. and N. Granny was attending college there. Her mother got sick. Her mother had cancer, breast cancer. I remember what Granny told me. And Granny came back here and took care of her mother. And she had a scholarship. Granny had a scholarship to go to A.M. and N. And she came home to take care of her mother, and she never went back. And she started off as a packer, but before she went to college, she used to go to work as a little packer. You know, as a girl, she went up there and worked in one of these African-American bathhouses. It was a bit, okay, thank you. And later she became, I can see here, a bather. But she also, later years, she became a massage therapist. And I told her she worked up, she was 87 years old. And she was awesome. She worked at the Arlington and both the Majestic.
Yeah, and even those photos there are right in this building that we are sitting in right now.
And she worked here.
And so, you know, I can explain these stories, and I enjoy explaining these stories, as you folks may have been able to tell. But, you know, getting it right from the source, getting it from these men and women that worked here, you know, it's an invaluable treasure that we now have at the National Park. And it's something that, you know, you have to see to really enjoy. Reading a transcript does not show the excitement on her face on seeing a young version of her mentor. All of this stuff is just one other angle that we're trying to capture and preserve at the National Park. And so as I start to wrap up, you know, why are these stories important? I am glad that I have kept the attention of you folks here, but why tell these stories? Why share them? Well, part of it is because we can lose them. The picture behind me is the Pythian Bathhouse. In the Pythian Bathhouse was one of the pinnacles of the Black community in Hot Springs, offered some of the most amazing park history that we have. The man behind me giving the massage was a man named Erskine Bottoms. If Bottoms sounds familiar to anyone, if you come to the National Park's Visitor Center on the second floor in the chiropody room, there was a physician that worked in the Fordyce, and his name was Timothy Bottoms. Timothy Bottoms is the son of Erskine. More generational change that occurred within the bathhouses here in the National Park. But can anyone tell me where the Pythian Bathhouse is right now?
It's gone.
It sure is.
Parking lot.
Yep. And so this is just one snippet. It's the tiniest of snippets on why capturing these photos, that photo of Erskine Bottoms, it appeared in Ebony magazine in 1949. one of the largest distributed Black magazines in the entire country, featured not just an article on Edith Irby Jones going to medical school, but also on the attractions, the health benefits of visiting hot springs. Also, prior to these projects and prior to the work of the national park, we were, hamstrung a little bit with offering what the bathing experience was like for these men and women. Behind me is on the 3rd floor in one of the massage rooms in the Fordyce, and it is a blank-faced, dark-colored mannequin administering massages. These are nameless men and women doing jobs that look subservient, that look like simple service jobs. What we're trying to do with the national park is to expand upon that, is to critique our own work, to update our own work in a number of different ways. On the left is an explanation accompanying these mannequins, centering on a specific individual working in the bathhouse. Her name was Katie Tate. She had family members that ultimately had worked in the national park itself and became park rangers. On the right-hand side is digital representations and digital exhibits. In the glass case behind you, it's tough to see, but there's a woman. Her name is Vivian Lemons, and she has a nameplate that we've preserved. Well, Vivian Lemons was just one of many Lemonses that worked within the bathhouse. And if you scan that QR code, you can do it right now. You guys can pull your phone out and scan it right now, or you can go to the visitor center. If you scan that, what appears is an entire web page of the different Lemonses that worked within the bathhouses. Folks like Richard Lemons, who was the president of the Bathhouse Attendants Association, that organization that Jesse Smith started in the 1910s, worked for Vivian Lemons, but also worked for Ernest Lemons and Jimmy Lemons, which were men that worked in the Buckstaff and the Majestic Bathhouse for decades. All of that is wrapped up in just one family's name, and that gets to be expressed and shared in the national park. As visitors walk right by it, they can pull their phone out and they can take that with them well outside of the confines of the visitor center. And so, why is this important for not just us at the national park, but for all of us that live here in Hot Springs? That these stories really do. They offer a new and exciting way for visitors to connect to Hot Springs. That these stories can resonate with visitors' lived experiences as much as a celebrity sighting. Now, I get it. I see these folks day in and day out. That folks visit the visitor center, they come in, they want to know where Al Capone took a bath. They want to know where FDR took a bath. They want to be in the presence of fame and celebrity. But at the same time, to get people to understand how this place worked, because I'm sure I'm not the only one in this room that people come to Hot Springs and they go, what is this place? What is this town? How does this work? What are these buildings here? How and why is this a national park? These stories can offer a great supplement to that. They can put people in the idea of working hard for a job, of trying to keep a job, of having strains outside of the workplace affect you both in and out of, your 9 to 5, or in these folks' cases, sometimes 6 to 6. And so all of those are things that folks can immediately attach themselves to. That's part of the work that we're trying to do with the national park. In order to do that, these stories have to get out and be shared. That is why I love doing things like this, whether it's to 2 or to 22 people or to 220 people. All of those are ways that I and we at the park can share these stories. We can guide them to the visitor center, but if folks can never get to the visitor center, don't want to get into the traffic that is Central Avenue, we can always send them to the website too. We are updating it constantly to add more and more of these stories into not just the park's history, the state's history, but also the nation's history. And I think it's important to highlight once again that this is not replacing the history of famous visitors, but it's adding to Hot Springs' rich history. The reason I fell in love with this town and this park when I was doing my research on it was because the water that issues from the ground here has brought so many people together to one spot for centuries. They've come for a variety of different reasons. They've cared for a variety of different things, but the water is that unifying concept. And once we get here, there are so many stories we get to tell. And so it's up to us. It's up to us at the National Park. It's up to the members and supporters of the Historical Society. It's up to just ordinary Hot Springs visitors that when folks start to ask, what's there to see here? What's this place about? We can not only attach stories of fame, celebrity, and significance on one level, but we can also show that the everyday, the quotidian, the things that folks did day in and day out in the national park and around town are some things that every single person, whether they're old, young, black, white, all of us have ideas of family, of service, of commitment, of success, opportunities, and struggle. All of those are wrapped up in the stories that you got to see today, and hopefully we'll be able to see much more as we work through this project at the National Park. So thank you so much, folks. The QR code that you see here is the park's website. You can certainly scan it right now if you want and save it. That will take you right to the Bathhouse attendance site at the National Park. Please feel free. But again, thank you so much, and I would be happy to take any questions that you folks have. Thanks.
This is not a question, but she got her hand up. You talked about her family here.
My parents are my mother's Vivian Lemons and my dad also lives at the Bathhouse.
Well, I would love to chat in just a second when we wrap up. That is part of the exciting part is it is very difficult. The bathing industry itself, as we all know, has waxed and certainly waned from Hot Springs. And that meant that, very similar to my family in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the steel industry, when the main industry leaves, so do people. And so finding interviews, finding folks that can share stories has been a challenge, but at the same time, an opportunity. And so anytime I get to share these and someone is in the crowd that has family that I may have mentioned that wants to share stories, believe me, I will be in touch as soon as we wrap up.
We had a couple questions from Facebook.
Sure.
Jackie says, good morning from California. And could you speak more about James Ferguson, the family linked to him?
Sure. What was the name?
Jackie.
Jackie, if possible, I'd love if you could leave any contact information. I'd be happy to reach out. The James Ferguson there was one of brothers Fergusons that were here in Hot Springs. Both worked at the Quapaw, which is where we have the lucky photograph in the Christmas card that I'd be happy to share. The nice part about all of this is all of this was either at the National Park Service Archives, the National Archives, or the Historical Society. This stuff belongs to you folks as much as it belongs to us at the park. And so the Fergusons worked at both the Quapaw and the Fordyce. We have records that show exactly how many days the Ferguson men were working. That was part of a wage study in the 1940s for the National Park Service to try to improve wages for bathhouse attendants. So if we do get some contact information, I'd be happy to reach out some more. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you for actually coming and sharing all this. I appreciate it. My family's been here since the 1880s. But what I'd like to learn from you is because it's heartbreaking to go through that neighborhood just behind the bathhouses and the convention center and see how devastated it's been. And over the course of, I don't know how many years it's been, I suppose, since about 1967, as the, I don't know whether it was the gangsters that went, the gambling that went away, that and the bathhouses kind of also began to dilapidate, that everything started to fall down. Has the national park done anything within government to try and restore or make that part of the national park?
Sure.
And bring something that can be representative of what it might have been like at that time?
Sure, that's a great question. It's a great suggestion. I can say that as I'm sure you're well and everyone here is well aware, the boundaries of the national park have changed drastically in the past 190 plus years, from Hot Springs Reservation to Hot Springs National Park. It is an incredible undertaking to both expand or subtract or contract national park boundaries. One of the things that we try to do, and one of the things that I hope we do successfully, is to work with community members. I think that the work that the community has done to create the Pleasant Street Historic District is one of the more significant things that can be done to both preserve the buildings that are still in place, to try to find interpretive angles to explain the buildings that aren't there anymore. I know that at the National Park, our newest exhibits have both photos of both the Pythian and the Woodmen of the Union. That is the connection we have to these areas. Wherever, I always like to say, wherever the thermal water goes, so does the history of the National Park, whether that is park boundaries or not. And so when the park boundary, or when the water was sent down Malvern Avenue to both the Pythian and the Woodmen and the National Baptist, the park's history went with it. That means communications, correspondences, but that also means a responsibility to tell the stories of those places. I hope that we continue to try to do that. I know it has been a passion and a commitment of mine, of our team, the interpretive division at the National Park, to include not just those stories, but evidence of those stories, evidence of those people in the records that we have, so that they aren't anecdotes that people can just say, well, that might have happened or it might not have happened. No, this did happen. It happened. It was an incredible history. And the downfall of it is similarly something to talk about, whether that is stories of urban renewal, of hotels going up in the place of folks that had the least or had the least representation in their government for a number of both personal and systemic reasons. All of those stories not only connect Hot Springs, communities in Hot Springs that may not have chatted with each other for decades, but it also connects Hot Springs to communities all across the country. Urban renewal throughout the 50s and 60s was something that decimated communities, and decimated communities of color specifically, whether that is the construction of highways, whether that's the expansion of urban centers. All of that affected groups that had the least amount of representation, and it was often communities of color.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Have you considered the notion that there was also, from the time of emancipation, that there was this westward movement, of course, and the Homestead Act, and that Homestead Act kind of also undermined what opportunities African Americans could actually have during that next period of great immigration from Europe.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel fortunate to be able to tell the histories here in Hot Springs is that oftentimes the service industries that were forced upon communities of color as a result of the Homestead Act in the 1860s, not homesteading African American free persons, is oftentimes a story of minimum wage, of menial labor, and of struggle. Here in Hot Springs, as a result of both the Hot Springs Commission, which came in the 1870s to 1880, which changed the boundaries of Hot Springs Reservation, allotted a number of titles to Black men and Black women. One of the individuals I did not talk about was a man named Henry Battle. Henry Battle came from the Little Rock area, but purchased land from the national park or the reservation in the 1880s and was a bathhouse attendant. He couldn't read, he couldn't write, What he could do was secure not just his freedom, secure his opportunity by securing land, which in the 1880s and even today is one of the most important things on passing along generational power and wealth to family members. And so those are some of the stories that we get, that I feel and we at the park feel fortunate that we get to talk about. Oftentimes, if you would have come to the national park 15, 20 years ago, we were just starting to talk about the lives of these men and women. And it was tough because we didn't know, we didn't reach out to the community. One of the things that I have felt so fortunate about is being able to participate in community events at the Webb Center for Malvern Avenue Day, for Juneteenth, things that get the national park more visible in the community, that shows, you have an ally, you have a supporter, you have folks that want to tell these stories. Granted, I know the color of my skin, and I know that it's not always the best one to talk about African-American history. But what I've always learned and what I've been taught is that if you care about the people that you're talking about, if you care about the sources, and if you treat the sources with the same respect and dignity that they deserve, that the work's going to speak for itself. And I really hope that this work does.
Well, it's American history.
Absolutely, sir.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, guys.
Dan, we want to thank you, Dan, for your fabulous scholarship and your great passion for this work and for all the people who created this community. You did a tremendous job. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
And thank everybody here for coming, and I hope you'll be with us again on Tuesday, February the 13th for another fascinating program. Thank you.